At 9:02 on a Tuesday morning, Donald Trump signed an executive order. His advisors had assured him that within 72 hours, Canada would be on its knees. The strategy was simple: overwhelming economic force, a blanket tariff, a suspension of energy agreements, an ultimatum on dairy and lumber, the full weight of the American market, 280 times larger than its northern neighbor, brought down like a hammer. But by 11:47 that same morning, that hammer had not only been stopped, it had been turned around and driven back into the foundation of American trade strategy, not with a press release, not with a diplomatic note, but with a sequence of coordinated countermeasures, so precise, so devastating, and so impossibly fast that senior officials in Washington spent the rest of the day asking a single question, one that nobody in that building could answer. How did they do it in under 3 hours? The answer to that question is not a story about tariffs. It is a story about preparation versus improvisation, about a superpower that believed its size was its strategy, and a mid-sized nation that had been quietly, methodically, invisibly building the architecture of its response for 18 months before the order was ever signed. Trump's team believed the shock of that executive order would paralyze Ottawa. They had planned for confusion, for panic, for a frantic phone call to the White House begging for relief. What they did not know, what no one in the administration appears to have been told, is that Canada had wargamed this exact scenario down to the hour. The 9:02 order did not catch anyone off guard. It triggered a plan that was already loaded, already aimed, and already waiting for exactly this moment. The details of what happened between 9:02 and 11:47 that morning are more consequential than anything that has happened in North American economic history since the original NAFTA was signed. So let us go through it, minute by minute, decision by decision, because the timeline is the argument. The executive order Trump signed at 9:02 was internally titled the North American Economic Sovereignty and Reciprocal Trade Act. Publicly, it was released simply as an executive trade action. But the contents were anything but simple. It imposed a blanket 35% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, a separate 52% surcharge on Canadian steel and aluminum, a full suspension of the joint energy framework that had governed cross-border electricity and petroleum flow for the previous 11 years, and embedded deep inside a demand that Canada renegotiate its dairy and softwood lumber protections within 90 days, or face an additional escalating tariff tier. The White House had prepared a full media rollout. Talking points were distributed to cabinet secretaries and congressional allies. The framing was deliberate: Canada as the aggressor, America as the nation finally defending itself. The Secretary of Commerce gave 3 morning television interviews before 10 a.m., each one describing the order as a necessary realignment that Canada would ultimately recognize as fair. In 2 of those interviews, he was asked whether Canada had been given advance notice. His answer, delivered with practiced confidence, was that Canada's trade representatives had been informed through appropriate channels, technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense. Canada had been told a trade action was coming. What the Secretary did not say, because perhaps he genuinely did not know, was what Canada had done with that information in the weeks and months preceding 9:02. 18 months before that executive order was signed, Canadian intelligence and trade analysts produced a classified assessment. It was called Scenario Delta, a document that does not officially exist, but whose existence has been confirmed by 3 separate sources familiar with its contents. Scenario Delta modeled exactly this situation: a blanket American tariff exceeding 30%, a simultaneous energy framework suspension, a demand for dairy and lumber renegotiation. It modeled the economic impact on Canadian industries. It modeled the political timeline in Washington. It modeled the likely public framing from the White House communications apparatus. And it outlined, in granular operational detail, a response framework calibrated to produce maximum economic counterpressure on the United States within a 4-hour window of any such order being signed. That 4-hour target was not arbitrary. Canadian trade analysts had calculated that based on American market open times, media cycle patterns, and the logistics of international financial communication, a response delivered within 4 hours would land before American business markets had fully processed the initial order, before the White House communications team had completed its rollout narrative, before allied governments had issued their first round of diplomatic statements. A response within 4 hours would not be seen as reactive. It would be seen and reported as simultaneous, as if Canada had not responded to America's move, but had moved at the same moment, on the same morning, as equals, not as a smaller nation scrambling to catch up to a superpower's decision. Canada's response arrived at 11:47, 2 hours and 45 minutes after the order was signed, 15 minutes ahead of their own 4-hour target. When the Canadian leader walked to the podium in Ottawa at 11:47, most American media assumed they were about to watch the standard diplomatic playbook: formal objection, reference to trade agreements, announcement of consultations, maybe a preliminary counter tariff on a symbolic category of American goods, the kind of measured, proportionate response that a smaller trading partner delivers when a larger one is moved against it. But what was actually announced was not measured, it was not symbolic, and it was not preliminary. The first element was a complete and immediate suspension of Canadian uranium exports to the United States. Canada is the world's second largest uranium producer. The United States sources approximately 28% of its nuclear fuel supply from Canadian operations, fuel that powers 93 American nuclear reactors, providing electricity to roughly 28 million American households. The suspension was effective immediately, with a formal notice period of 48 hours as required under existing bilateral agreements. But here is the detail that matters. The 48-hour clock had already started before the Canadian leader reached the podium. His team had filed the suspension notice at 10:53 that morning while the Secretary of Commerce was still completing his third television interview. The second element was the activation of what Canada internally designated the Critical Minerals Reorientation Protocol, a framework under which Canada would immediately redirect export licensing for 14 categories of critical mineral away from American buyers and toward pre-approved alternative purchasers in the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The minerals affected included cobalt, of which Canada supplies 38% of American industrial consumption, tellurium, used in American solar panel manufacturing, and indium, a component in approximately 60% of American flat panel display production. The reorientation was not a tariff. It was not a negotiating position. It was a physical redirection of supply chains executed through export licensing changes that took legal effect the moment the Canadian leader finished speaking. The third element was the announcement of binding agreements, signed that morning before 9 a.m., and with 7 European and 3 Pacific nations committing Canadian agricultural exports to new long-term supply arrangements at fixed prices. This was the element that produced the most visible reaction inside the White House, because it meant that the dairy and softwood lumber renegotiation demand embedded in Section 7 of Trump's executive order had already been rendered largely moot before the ink on the order was dry. The customers Trump assumed Canada would come crawling back to him to access had already been replaced. Not threatened with replacement, not proposed for replacement, replaced with signed contracts before 9 a.m. That last detail, the agricultural agreement signed before 9:00 on the same morning Trump signed his executive order, is the element that still has not been fully reported and its implications have not been fully absorbed in Washington. Canada did not sign those agreements in response to the executive order. Canada signed those agreements in anticipation of it, which means that somewhere in Ottawa, in the weeks and months preceding that morning, Canadian trade officials had not only predicted that this moment would come, they had used it as a deadline, a forcing function to get agricultural trade partners to commit, because Canada could go to those partners and say, with complete accuracy, that an American trade rupture was imminent, and that partners who moved early would get better terms than partners who waited to see how events developed. The threat of American aggression had been weaponized by Canada as a negotiating tool with third-party nations to build the replacement framework before the aggression actually arrived. As one European trade analyst later described it, when the timeline became clear, this was one of the most sophisticated applications of anticipatory economic diplomacy in the post-war period. Canada had turned the inevitability of American pressure into leverage with everyone except America. The Canadian team that executed this strategy spent 3 hours on the morning of that day, confirming, finalizing, and preparing to announce a response that had taken 18 months to build. Trump's team spent those same 3 hours conducting media interviews, explaining why Canada would have no choice but to comply. The 11:47 response landed in the White House at approximately 11:52, when the first wire service alert moved across the screens in the Situation Room. According to 3 officials with knowledge of events in the building that morning, the initial reaction was confusion, not alarm. The uranium suspension was the first element processed, and the immediate question from senior staff was whether Canada had the legal authority to execute such a suspension under existing bilateral agreements. The answer came back from the legal team within 19 minutes. Yes, under the terms of the existing energy framework, whose suspension had been included in Trump's 902 executive order, Canada retained full discretionary authority over export licensing for all strategic materials. In suspending the energy framework, the executive order had simultaneously removed the primary legal constraint on Canadian export redirection. The White House had, in effect, handed Canada the legal instrument it needed to execute the Critical Minerals Reorientation Protocol by removing the treaty structure that would otherwise have complicated it. A senior National Security Council official described the next 20 minutes in the Situation Room as the most uncomfortable room temperature shift he had ever experienced in government. It took the legal team's answer to make the full picture visible. The administration had spent 18 months escalating pressure on Canada. Canada had spent those same 18 months using that pressure to build a response. And then on the morning the pressure was supposed to reach its decisive conclusion, the executive order had inadvertently removed the last legal obstacle to that response being executed in full. The economic impact projections arrived on the Situation Room screens at approximately 1:30 that afternoon. The uranium suspension alone was projected to cost American energy producers between $4.2 and $6.8 billion in the first year in alternative sourcing costs, with a projected 14-month delay before alternative supply chains could be fully established. The critical minerals reorientation was projected to disrupt American manufacturing supply chains in solar, display, and defense electronics, with a first-year impact estimated at $11.3 billion. The new agricultural trade agreements meant that the 90-day renegotiation clock in Section 7 of the executive order was now running against a Canadian government that had reduced its dependence on American agricultural markets by approximately 34%. By 2 p.m., the response Canada had delivered in under 3 hours was already projected to cost American interests more in year one than Trump's tariffs were projected to generate in revenue over the same period. The administration had not broken Canada. It had activated Canada's response, and the response was winning. When the Canadian leader spoke at 11:47, he was composed in a way that, in retrospect, communicates everything about the nature of what Canada had prepared. He did not raise his voice. He did not display anger. He did not engage in the kind of rhetorical escalation that a leader who had been surprised and was improvising would naturally default to. He spoke the way a person speaks when they are reading from a plan they are confident in, because he was. The most important thing he said at the podium was also the shortest. After announcing the 3 primary countermeasures, he paused, looked directly at the cameras, and said, "Canada has been preparing for this morning for some time. We are ready to continue. We are also ready to stop. The decision about which of those 2 things happens next belongs to Washington, not to Ottawa." 14 words in that final sentence, and they inverted the entire power dynamic of the morning. Trump's executive order had been designed to force Canada into a position of supplication to make Ottawa come to Washington asking for relief. The Canadian leader's response had placed the decision about what happened next in Washington's hands, not as a concession, but as a burden. If this continued, it would continue because Washington chose to continue it. The cost of continuation would be borne by American consumers, American manufacturers, American energy users. The choice was America's. The consequences were also America's. He then walked away from the podium without taking questions. The press conference had lasted 11 minutes. The sophistication of what Canada executed did not emerge from that morning. It emerged from a decision made 18 months earlier, at a moment when most analysts were still describing the early trade tensions as posturing rather than policy. The Canadian government had made a strategic judgment that American escalation was not episodic, but structural, that the administration's approach to Canada was not a negotiating tactic with a resolution built into it, but a political position that would continue to escalate until it met resistance that imposed genuine costs. Based on that judgment, Ottawa had made a second decision that the most effective response to escalating pressure was not counter-escalation in kind, which would play into the administration's preferred narrative of mutual aggression, but the quiet, patient, invisible construction of alternatives, making Canadian dependence on American markets structurally smaller before the confrontation arrived. Every signed contract, every redirected supply chain, every third-party agricultural agreement that preceded the 902 executive order represented one piece of that architecture. Individually, each piece was unremarkable, the normal business of trade diplomacy, but collectively, executed over 18 months and activated simultaneously on a single morning, they constituted something qualitatively different. A country that had been told it was dependent on America had spent 18 months becoming less dependent, quietly, without announcement, without provocation. One contract, one licensing agreement, one bilateral framework at a time. By the time Trump signed the order at 9:02, Canada had already spent 18 months building the exit. The order was the door. Canada had already found its way around it. Trade war day zero is significant, not because of the tariffs, not because of the countermeasures, not even because of the timeline, as remarkable as that timeline is. It is significant because of what it revealed about the fundamental nature of the conflict that produced it. The American strategy had been premised on an asymmetry, a superpower, and a smaller neighbor. A nation with $28 trillion in GDP and a nation with $2.1 trillion, the assumption embedded in every escalation, every ultimatum, every executive order was that the asymmetry of scale was decisive, that Canada could not afford to resist because the cost of resistance would be unbearable, and that once Canada understood this, compliance would follow. What Trade War Day Zero demonstrated is that asymmetry of scale is not the same as asymmetry of preparation. A smaller country that has spent 18 months building alternatives, redirecting supply chains, signing contracts, and developing contingency frameworks can impose disproportionate costs on a larger country that has spent those same 18 months assuming its size made preparation unnecessary. Canada did not match American power on that morning. Canada made American power expensive, and making power expensive is in the history of international economic conflict. Among the most effective strategies a smaller nation can deploy against a larger one, the 22-page framework document is still on the Commerce Secretary's desk. The Canadian leader is still in Ottawa. The uranium clock is still running. The mineral supply chains are still redirected. The agricultural contracts are still in force. Trump signed the order at 9:02. Canada's response arrived before noon, and the morning that was supposed to end in Canadian compliance is now the morning being studied in trade ministries from Brussels to Tokyo as the model for how a prepared nation absorbs superpowers' pressure and turns it into leverage. The order is signed. The response is filed. The costs are accumulating, and somewhere in a Commerce Department office in Washington, a 22-page document that was supposed to have been delivered to Ottawa 72 hours after 9:02 is still waiting to be sent. Ottawa never asked for it. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.